I think you'll realize from that introduction I've come from a slightly different angle than some of the previous speakers, that I'm not an expert on regulatory affairs. I come from the business side, and so the perspectives I give maybe are slightly colored by that compared to the more technical perspectives you've heard. And what I want to share with you is really a personal analysis or a personal review of some of the learnings as I've been through this process of authorization for HBCDD. We applied for 2 uses, and the 2 uses were one for the manufacture and use of pellets, which are called expandable polystyrene, containing the flame retardant HBCDD. And the picture there on the left shows you what these look like. These are very, very small beads from about 0.5 to 1 millimeter inside. When we sell these to our customers, we get into the second use, which is production of articles with these pellets, and these pellets are then expanded, probably about 30 times to their original size, and then made into various articles. And the key application for us, and the key application here where flame retardancy is required, is for insulation foams. It may be interesting that this was a joint application. There were 13 applicants, so 13 different legal entities representing 8 different companies, and together we represent over 50% of production capacity for expandable EPS in Europe. Our objective, and from the business side, the problem we had was that we knew what the legislation was, we knew that HBCD had a sunset date, and yet we were not sure there would be adequate alternative by the time we reached that sunset date. So we wanted to ensure, and we still want to ensure, that we can continue supplying flame-retarded EPS, as is required by national legislation, while phasing out the product which has been set with a sunset date. We structured our consortium with 2 committees, and each of the 8 companies were represented in those 2 committees. There's a steering committee to take the major decisions, but really the focus was on a technical committee which worked through all the technicality and all the questions which came from that. In order to do that, we employed some help. So Reach Centrum was our project management, and they managed the whole project as well as the subcontractors. It's important, as you would realize, within this group on a joint application here of competitors, that things like confidential business information is managed not only to the external world, but also to the internal world. We are competitors, so we had to manage our own information, and by having a third party independent, that was the way we managed that. As you see, we used a couple of technical consultants and economic consultants in order to help us work through the requirements. And we had a democratic process by which we had any decisions that we had to make final, then we accepted a 2/3 majority, and happily the 1/3 always accepted that. Maybe just a little outline of what the EPS industry is in Europe. There are 3 main suppliers of flame retardants in Europe, and the HBCDD has been and still is today the main flame retardant for EPS and XPS. And where one of my colleagues here was saying that it's much easier, 10 times more easy for the downstream to submit an application, my experience would be I'd like to have the producers submitting. So for me, that would certainly be 10 times easier. There are 13 EPS raw material users making mixtures, so making pellets, with 19 plants in Europe. And there are about 600, roughly, converters who take these pellets and make them into articles in Europe. Overall, the market is of the order of 1,400,000 tons in Europe, of which about 860,000 metric tons are flame retarded with HBCDD. As I say, the main market for that, for the flame retarded, is in buildings. The other large application, which you will be aware of, is for packaging. So when you unpack your brand new flat screen TV with that white foam, that is normally EPS. In terms of the flame retardant, the total European market has been around about 12,000 metric tons, and the EPS application is about half of that. The other half is for XPS, which is also used in insulation materials. And as I've already said, the applicants represent the majority of this market. So why did we look for authorization? Well, we'd worked as an industry, so we worked with our colleagues in XPS and EPS. We've also worked with the flame retardant producers over the last 10 years to look for alternatives to HBCDD. And we identified what we thought and believe still is the best alternative to HBCDD. But having identified that product, you then need to commercialize it, and the producers of flame retardant need to scale up production in order to supply a commercial product to meet the requirements of not only the European market, but the global market. And so we had a concern that by the sunset date of August the 21st this year, there would still not be sufficient commercial product available in order for us to supply a market with flame retarded EPS, which, again, you'll be aware, is a very important element in terms of energy efficiency and in terms of climate change mitigation within the European framework. Today, there is one plant fully up and running in the US. So of the 3 flame retardant producers, there's one plant fully up and running, supplying about 10,000 tons of material, or a capacity of 10,000 tons of material. There's a small plant in Holland, which is also supplying the market, about 2,500 tons. And there is one new plant, which is being commissioned, which is based in Israel. And interestingly, the 3 independent producers who are supplying HBCDD as majority producers in Europe today, 2 of those have combined in order to make this new alternative, which we call the polymeric flame retardant. So in terms of us as customers, we have 2 suppliers now as opposed to 1 or 2 independent units of operation as opposed to the 3 we were expecting. We need the additional capacity of this new plant in Israel, which again is targeted at 10,000 tons, in order to be able to fulfill the requirements in Europe. And again, we mustn't forget that this is also supplying on a global basis, so it's not just the European environment, it's also the global demands that have to be satisfied by these plants. It's also important to realize that EPS, although it sounds like a very scientific product, like most production processes, production is an art as much as a science. And each of the production sites are different. And so when we have a new product, which is a polymer, that polymer can have different properties coming from different suppliers, and the way it reacts in our production processes can differ from one plant to another. So it's not as easy as just having a product coming out of our supplier and putting it into our plants. We need to test it on each of our plants. Our plants are not a single unit. They're made of several reactors, and each of those reactors can be different. So it takes a while to actually prove technically that this new product works on each of our reactors. So that's why we say we need a little bit of time between now, when we hope we're going to start seeing some material from the new plant in Israel, which today we haven't seen, but we're promised is due within the next 2 to 3 months. And when we have that, we still need time in order to prove it technically from our perspective before we can sample our customers and make sure from our customers' perspective it's also a suitable product. I won't go through this slide in detail, you'll be pleased to know. But it is trying to summarize a little bit of the complexity of the situation, not just for us who are trying to understand it from a user point of view, but I think also from the political perspective, that the REACH process preceded the UNEP Stockholm Convention. So a sunset date was already set by REACH as the 21st of August this year. Then UNEP Stockholm Convention came along, listed HBCDD as a POP with its own sunset date, which happened to precede the sunset date under REACH. So the Commission had to make a decision here, which they have taken, which is to opt out of the Stockholm Convention until the REACH sunset date. And it took a little bit of time to reach that decision, which gave some uncertainty into the industry. But it means that we are back where we hoped we would be, with essentially a sunset date 21st of August this year. Under the UNEP decision, there is also an exemption period. So any authorization which is granted has to also comply with any conditions of exemption under the UNEP process. So trying to harmonize these two processes is not easy. In addition, there are still ongoing discussions under the Basel Convention looking at how you manage the waste POP materials, and there's still the decision to be taken as to what the lower POP level is for these materials, which will obviously determine a whole number of other factors as we move forward. So those discussions are continuing. So it is a complex situation. It's also been a complex situation in perspective from a HBCDD user's perspective. As you've noticed, there are three main producers of HBCDD. These are the key, or at least one of them is the key registrant for HBCDD, but they're also the manufacturers or the alternative. And so there's a potential conflict of interest here in terms of trying to help us in terms of getting authorization, because they need to manage that transition the same way as we try to manage that transition, and we have different criteria to do that. It is a commercial and competitive situation out there. So some of our competitors within the market have been working early adopters in terms of looking at new technologies, taking the ability to use a different flame retardant, securing supply from a limited capacity, and so making it harder for the rest of us to get our hands on the required alternative until there is sufficient capacity in the marketplace. I've already mentioned we're competitors within consortium, so we have to manage that. And if we look at our downstream, they look at the kind of picture I put up before, and they don't understand what this means for them, either in terms of timing, in terms of how they have to manage their supply chain, how they have to empty their supply chain, what happens to recycling materials. And so there's a whole amount of education of not only the 600 customers in Europe, but also the further downstream to the users and to recyclers and so on. So there's a lot of education and confusion, especially with this playing between UNEP processes and REACH processes. Any change of this nature has a cost. I would say humbly that our industry is under pressure. It is a very competitive industry. With the economic downturn in Europe and construction being down in Europe, it's been a difficult industry for us. So the additional costs of going through this process has been not welcomed. In terms of having to change, what are the economics of the change? We indicated quite clearly, both within this process and within the UNEP processes, that there is an additional cost for the new flame retardant because you have to use it in larger quantities. It's not so efficient, doesn't have so much bromine in there compared to HBCDD, and the actual cost to manufacture is higher, so there is an on-cost going downstream of up to about 5% additional cost to our end users. We can pass that cost on, or we can decide not to pass it on. Again, a commercial decision if we do that. But at the end of the day, if you look at variations in costs of polymers, and expanded polystyrene is no exception. Today, with oil prices going southwards in the last 3 months, then the variation of that cost is probably a lot larger than the variation in costs of an additional new flame retardant. So what are our experiences from authorization? It's certainly been very helpful for us to have one single focal point within ECHA for our applications, so we know who to go to. We have a funnel here for information both ways. As we've heard from other speakers here, the PSIS was very useful. Certainly for those of us who are new to the process, it helped us wet our feet and just get a feel of what we're letting ourselves in for. However, my takeaway, apart from some very good guidance in specific areas, was there was a lot of do what you think best. So you're the industry, you know your applications, do what you think best. And there were some themes which I'll just mention in a minute or two which kept on recurring when we did what we thought was best, but we're still, I don't think, completely satisfied what was required by the RAC and the SEAC. No surprise, it takes a long time to prepare these applications. Again, our dossier, I think, is about 400 pages and costly, both in human time and in time of consultants. And what I would say here is proportionality. When I looked at this, compared perhaps with the decision of extension on the UNET process, there seemed to be a lot of paperwork, a lot of discussion, a lot of toing and froing, and what we were looking for really was a safety net in case this additional plant from Israel doesn't come on stream in order to allow us to continue making flame retardant EPS. So we needed proportionality. We had, as I mentioned, some problem access through our suppliers of flame retardants to the CSR. Again, we've heard this before. They were asking a lot of money for us to have access to this. In the end, this was not viable. So we went ahead and actually made our own CSR specific to the applicant. So it was very targeted and very specific to the needs and the applications. I think as one of the first PBTs to go through this process, we were on the learning curve, and I think ECHA on the learning curve. And certainly the impression I had that was the guidance was not always clear and not maybe as fulsome as we would like it to be. But I'm sure this will change with the experiences that we've been through. And maybe two key elements there, which were a couple of themes which came through. One was what actually demonstrates adequate exposure. Exposure assessment and control for PBT materials. And there was an ongoing, and I think probably still an ongoing discussion here about whether you should include worker exposure or not for a PBT where the T is determined by environmental and not by human health criteria. We had plenty of opportunities, or it seemed like we had plenty of opportunities to explain and to discuss. We had the PSIS, we had written questions, we had the trialogue, comment on draft opinion. But as I said, we're still not clear at the end of the day, where we did not convince. We felt we were following guidelines. We felt we were doing everything we'd asked to do, but clearly there was a lack there and something was not understood or not communicated properly two ways. And that's something that I think moving forward needs to improve. It's also a lengthy process. We started 2 years ago. Maybe we could have started earlier, but we had to sort out our own industry situation first of all. And as we get nearer the sunset date now, there's increasing pressure, and we're still waiting for a decision on authorization. Impact on industry, it's been divisive and decisive. It's been divisive because there have been differences of opinion from a commercial point of view and positioning of the players in this industry. Some countries and regions are sensitized, and so they go forward a lot faster than others, so the timing for substitution differs. And as the sunset date approaches, we still need to know what's going to happen, and we need to understand what is going to be required of us as we move forward. I've mentioned the complexity and lack of clarity with the Basel Convention, and that discussion still continues. There's particular concern on how to manage some other streams of EPS, which may or may not be contaminated with HBCD. And we need to look at a recommendation which is put forward by the RAC in terms, and SAAC in terms of monitoring for authorization and any other conditions that are imposed in terms of the Stockholm Convention. So my time has been up, I've noticed. I apologize for that, but a couple maybe of lessons for the future. Clearly apply early. The earlier you can apply, the better and more time, so you don't get into this time pressure we have today. I believe decision processes need to be streamlined, and in terms of maybe the PSIS is an opportunity to look at what actually is being demanded, and if you're looking for a short term in order to allow the manufacturer of an alternative to catch up with demand, then maybe that should be taken into account without quite so much paperwork required. And what I would also suggest is that even though it is very good to have one focal point within ECHA, actually the opportunities to have direct dialogue and to get real clarity with RAC and SEAC was missing. And I think if we had the ability to have a direct dialogue, we maybe clarified some of the issues a lot earlier. So with that, thank you very much.